Aither. So welcome everyone. It's good to see a good group of people excited by policy and economics. My name is Jarrah O'Shea, Executive General Manager of Strategy, Economics and Data at Cobb & Water in Bendigo. I've been in finance and economics roles for 10 years and at Cobb & Water, and before that at the Essential Services Commission. While I am an economist at heart, I have recently obtained my CPA qualification, and that makes for a dangerous mix of philosophies. The presentation by Aither today will serve as an update on the Sector Economics Review, a critical piece of work being undertaken across our sector. And I'm a member of the Project Steering Committee. So for a bit of housekeeping, we are using Zoom Webinar as our online platform. If you're new to Zoom Webinar, please be aware that you will not be able to switch on your camera or microphone during the session. To get the best possible connection, please ensure you close all unnecessary applications and check that no one else in your household is streaming 4K movies or searching for extraterrestrial life or anything else that may put strain on your internet connection. This session is interactive and offers two opportunities for you to discuss with your peers in breakout rooms. So Aither will lead off with a presentation on the current status of the exciting project. Then we'll break out into groups to discuss the interim results. After this, we'll reconvene and discuss key issues raised in the groups. Finally, our second breakout will provide an opportunity for you to give feedback to how the Sector Economics Review will proceed. The session today will be recorded and a link will be provided to watch the replay, available from next Monday. There will be a 30-minute break at 2:45 before we move into the next session at 3:15. On to the speakers. Aither is a leading Australian economic and policy advisory firm specialising in the water industry. Chris Olszak is a founding director of Aither and one of Australia's leading water economists and strategic advisors. Tim Ryan is a regulatory economist who leads Aither's pricing and economic regulation practice. David Heeps, who I'm sure we've all met at some stage, is a senior associate at Aither and has considerable experience in the Victorian water industry, having been the CEO of the Essential Services Commission and also several executive roles within utilities. Nothing further ado, I'll hand over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Jarrah. And we do have a slideshow for this, which Tim will put up now. Thanks for coming along to this session today, and I'd like to thank Jarrah, Peter, and all of Vic Water for the opportunity to have this discussion with you today. We've been really excited to work on this project and really glad to be appointed to the project. It's a really great opportunity for us to have an early discussion about the preliminary findings. Sorry about that. Look, Aither's purpose is about helping our clients, particularly in the water sector, make better decisions about things that matter. And this project is really highly aligned with that, and we're really grateful to be involved. So it's not a great start here. Essentially, the project looks at the challenges facing the industry. It aims to assess these issues and identify what things are most important to the industry and what are the things that the industry can do about. What we'll do today is talk through the context and approach to the project. I'll do that. Then Tim will give you an overview of the modelling work that's been done to date and some of the early findings. And I do stress that these are early findings and early results. We're going to present some of the directional findings rather than specific numbers, because we're still working through the process of finalising the assumptions and the numbers and those findings. And this is a great opportunity for us to speak to you about those findings. Then we're going to go into a breakout sessions or two breakout sessions. The first will be to get your reactions on the findings around the challenges that we've identified and assessed. And then the second will be to provide us with early ideas on what are the types of opportunities that either the industry could pick up or governments or regulators could pick up to help the sector over the long term address the challenges that it's facing from an economic perspective. So Tim, I'll get you to switch to the next slide on the context. And Aither works with water utilities all around Australia, and we see many of the same common challenges and opportunities. And effectively, this can be summarised by the challenge of having increased, diverse, and changing expectations on water businesses, while at the same time having concerns around affordability and the cost of doing more with less for customers. So in this project, we identify a range of challenges that are common across Australia, and particularly common and commonly talked about across Victoria. But we try and quantify how important these different challenges are from the perspective of their impacts on water utility costs and flow-on impacts to customer bills in real terms. So this enables us to look at a very high level, which ones of these challenges that come up in debate are most important, how may they play out, across metros versus larger regional water corps versus smaller regional water corps. And then that gives us a common base for the industry to go forward and talk about how to deal with these challenges. So Tim, I'll get you to go to the next slide. So yes, our role is to explore these challenges in a report, provide a report to the industry, particularly to the managing directors, with a set of key messages around which of the challenges are most important, how material are they, and what are the opportunities to address those challenges going forward. Tim, I'll get you to the next one. There's two clear phases to the project. We're at the end, or coming to the end of phase one, where we're identifying and estimating the scale and significance of different challenges affecting the industry. We're about to go into phase two, which is what can be done about those challenges. And in this workshop today, we'll be looking at both sides, getting your initial reactions on our results for phase one, as well as some of your ideas around phase two. So with that, I will hand over to Tim to give you an overview of the modelling approach that's been used to assess the materiality of different factors and talk through those initial findings and results. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, as Chris mentioned, we'll now move into, I suppose, understanding how the model works, what went into the model, and so how we captured those bill impacts from the different challenges that we identified. So firstly, we're going to go through the overview of the method to assessing the impact of the challenge. So the first step there is essentially understanding the challenges facing the industry. So Chris, in that previous slide there, was talking about some of the challenges that are quite common across the industry. Those have been identified through a combination of our own experience of working in the industry, but we also went through a process of workshops with the industry, primarily MDs and executive level, to understand what the challenges are that are facing the different utilities. And also there was a group of industry experts external to the Victorian water industry that we also canvassed their opinions on to get a sense from them as to what they see as being some of the key challenges facing the industry. That then moved into the assessment phase. Once we've identified all those challenges, we then look at, well, what can be quantified and what can't be quantified, and what has to then be done under a qualitative assessment. So some of these things, some of these challenges can be quite difficult to quantify. So, the assumptions required could be quite difficult to understand and implement. So therefore, those types of challenges can only be considered from a qualitative perspective. And so we've kind of tried to separate them out from the actual modelling of the bill impacts. At the start of the quantitative assessment, we've identified the fact that there were some of these challenges that are quite interrelated. They couldn't necessarily be pulled out and looked at independently of each other. Because of that, we developed up some scenarios to consider them. And those scenarios primarily relate to the fact that these interrelated factors usually relate to business as usual scenarios. So a lot of the stuff which we'll touch on soon in terms of what those scenarios are, A lot of it relates to what the business has to do on an ongoing basis. There's also some discrete challenges that have been identified that can be quantified, and so we've captured them separately as well. So the outputs from that assessment are essentially looking at the impacts of the scenarios and being able to understand the impact on customer bills, modelling the impact on customer bills from those discrete challenges and the assumptions underpinning them, and then a qualitative discussion of the impacts from those qualitative challenges. So this now identifies the three scenarios that we considered. And so essentially they build on top of each other. So the first scenario there is we've named as the existing customer base. And this is essentially looking at, assuming that there's no increase in customer numbers from what the existing customer base is. If the industry just has to continue servicing that customer base, what's that likely to play out in terms of customer bills going forward? And the main challenge associated with that is looking at, the challenges are associated with aging assets and also the current RAB values, whereby for a number of the businesses, the RAB values are generally lower than replacement values. And so that puts upward pressure on the value of the RAB, which then feeds into the bill impacts as well. So that was the first scenario. The second scenario is essentially adding in growth on top of that. So if we now bring those new customers back in, consider the growth-related capital expenditure associated with servicing these new customers and any system augmentations. And so the population growth consideration needs to be given in terms of brownfield versus greenfield developments, where they sit, and essentially those long-term capital expenditure profiles for the businesses. The third scenario is then overlaying all of that with climate change and kind of saying, well, in the future, we expect that there's going to be climate change impacts. What's that going to do to the future growth profile, future capital expenditure profile? So, which is likely to either bring forward capital expenditure or increase capital expenditure in relation to those first two scenarios. It essentially enhances some of those issues that are being faced, as well as the reduced water availability going forward from traditional sources, and therefore relying on potentially more costly water supply sources going forward. The discrete challenges that we've listed that we've gone to incorporate within the modelling. This is not obviously all of the challenges that the industry faces. There are probably an unending list of challenges that the industry faces. These are the challenges that we identified that we wanted to try and capture within the modelling. So what we thought could be quantified. So I won't go through them all in detail, but you can have a look at them there. Essentially, we've got the obligations to provide livability outcomes, the future changes in environmental and health regulations, carbon mitigation, waste reduction targets, increases in input costs, increasing interest rates, given the current historically low position, recreational access to storage facilities. We've got the inflation issue where there's the difference between the forecast and actual inflation in terms of setting prices. And another one, which I realised just 10 minutes before we started this that dropped off the list, is taxation, especially for the regional ones that are entering into a tax-paying position where they haven't been before. That's also going to place pressure on customer bills going forward as well. So now those are the scenarios and the challenges that we identified to feed into the model. We'll now just quickly touch on what the process was in terms of actually doing the modelling. I won't go into the specific details of everything, any granular kind of thing, but to try and give you an overview of the process that we've gone through to get to the results that we'll discuss shortly. There's essentially three key phases: inputs, the model itself, and then the outputs. The inputs, we've compiled information from a variety of sources. We put together an information request for the utilities to seek as much information as we could. We asked for quite granular information, reaching for the stars to try and get as much as we could. And so we used all the information that we could from the utilities and supplemented that with ESC inputs, both from their determinations and from the pricing submissions from the businesses. And then any further gaps required then data assumptions that were based on either industry knowledge or external sources that we could access. To undertake the modelling then of the impact of those challenges on bills, we built essentially an aggregated building block model, much like the ESC's building block pricing model. We essentially just aggregated that up into 3 groups. We've grouped them as metropolitan, large regional, and small regional. They could have been grouped in various different forms, but that was just the form that we felt was most appropriate. And the purpose of doing an aggregated thing is to try and not get into forecasting explicit impacts for individual businesses. We didn't want to be saying particular utilities were facing particular forecast price increases. That's up to the utilities themselves. This is more of a at that more of an aggregated level, but we wanted to try and provide some balance between that and have a bit more of a granular kind of process that could provide a bit more meaningful analysis between the different types of utilities within the industry. The outputs then following out of that relate to the scenarios and the challenges that we mentioned just before. So essentially we get a baseline of business as usual scenario from those scenarios, essentially the scenario 1 and scenario 2. And then the discrete challenges then look to essentially look at the incremental impacts, or essentially the shocks to that baseline, to understand what these potential future challenges, what impact they will have on customer bills going into the future. And so the modelling, I should say, also went out for a 30-year period, is what the term of the analysis was. So this is where I was mentioning the business as usual and the discrete challenges. And again, I've realised the text should be on there. What we've got there and what I wanted to highlight here is essentially that baseline grey shaded box, just to highlight that that's essentially the largely an industry-based position based on the information provided by the industry. So we try to get as robust as possible position to start with in terms of what the business as usual was for those existing customers and future growth scenarios 1 and 2. And then the climate change risk and the discrete challenges. A lot of those kind of impacts required assumptions, informed assumptions about what they might look like in terms of what their impact might be from a capital or operating expenditure perspective, and then applying those assumptions across that baseline to understand what the impact is on customer bills. So for example, looking at changing regulations, we considered what is a potential capital and operating expenditure impact over a long time period from changes in regulations for either a metro, a large regional, or small regional, and fed that into the model to then understand what that looked like on customer bills. Obviously, for things like changing regulations, it's highly dependent on what the actual regulation is, what the detail of it is. It's going to vary depending on each individual utility, but it's designed to try and provide some ballpark indication of the types of changes that might occur and what that would mean onto the bills for customers. So that's a quick high-level overview of the process that's gone into actually undertaking the modelling and determining what the potential impacts might be. So it's been informed by from industry engagement through the workshops up front, and also engagement with the project control group that Peter and Jara, who are in the webinar, have been involved in. So we'll go through now in terms of some of the indicative findings from the modelling. So we just wanted to stress, much like Chris did at the start, that the findings are indicative, the fact that it is still a draft of the report, and that there will be further refining of the inputs from the industry as we go forward, to try and make those assumptions that we've got in place more robust, and make sure that rather than it being in terms of that ballpark nature, trying to make it as targeted as possible, and having that balance between we can't get to a purely exact nature, but we can get somewhere fairly close to that based on informed industry opinion. So it's just some of the context as well with the indicative findings. As I said, it's not designed to be purely exact, and that it is likely to vary. It's not likely, it will vary across all of the industry, across the different utilities. We've tried to indicate that by having a range in terms of high and low, which you'll see soon in the figures, to try and indicate that, we're not trying to be exact. It's not perfect. We're not going to be a deterministic number in terms of where it will end up, but somewhere within a range of possible bill impacts going forward. And the analysis is trying to provide some relative materiality of these different changes rather than the exact impact of each individual thing, because we're looking at forecast challenges in the future, and that's going to be dependent on the clear definitions of what those changes might be, whether it's changing regulations or what changes in interest rates might be in the future. They're all going to be varied. We've had to make assumptions about what that looks like to be able to model that over the period going forward. And that means, the assumptions that we've used, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty going forward in terms of what all then might look like. So that's why we try to provide that range of what the impacts might be, and just to flag there's not going to be that exact indicative number. So these are some of the indicative findings that I'll touch on first. It's not an exhaustive list. This is just a summary to provide you a high level understanding. And this presentation itself is more at that high level. There is a lot more detail underpinning this within the report. But we wanted to give you what some of those kind of headline things are looking like, and what some of the key trends are that are coming out of it. And so the modelling indicates that bills would increase materially based on maintaining the current services to the existing customer base. But the fact that population growth has the ability to potentially offset those bill increases through a larger customer base. The materiality of how much that offset is based on a few factors. Obviously, the rate of the population growth going forward, the pattern of where the development occurs, whether it's greenfield, brownfield, and then individual utilities may have varying spare capacity within their networks currently, and then developer contributions as well in terms of how effective they are as price signal and how cost reflective they are going forward in terms of the forecasting of them. One of the hypotheses behind this project was to essentially test the theory that bills could remain constant or fall in the future. That was one of the, I suppose, the precursors behind all this, and why we try to do a business as usual scenario in the first place. And what we found overall is that the bills are expected to increase in real terms in the future across the different utility groups of the metros, the large regionals and the small regionals. And that these increases have the potential to be material unless action is undertaken to mitigate those impacts. This phase one doesn't look at any of those mitigation actions, so we haven't tried to model, what would happen if we, if the industry did anything to impact on them. That's phase two, and that'll be part of that discussion later on. The historically low interest rates are likely to mask some of these potential bill impacts in the short term. This stems from the trailing average that's used with the EC and setting the cost of debt with the WACC, and we'll touch on that later in the results, just to kind of give you an indication of what that looks like. Because it's a bit interesting, the fact that interest rates are likely to go up in the future, but the actual, the WACC cost of debt element is likely to decrease based on the function of the trailing average calculation. Some of the challenges that we've looked at, like livability and some of those other things, will likely impose higher costs, but they're also likely to deliver broader kind of customer and community benefits, with those beneficiaries expected to be ones that aren't necessarily your customer base. You're not charging them for it. So therefore, they'll have the consideration of some of the trade-off decisions that underpin some of those challenges going forward, especially if they are policy mandated positions. And through the modelling and considering, the future issues in terms of growth and everything else going on, there's quite a lot of capital expenditure requirement that's been forecast by the industry. It's estimated to be over $40 billion of capex over the 30-year period, which is obviously quite significant. From a regulatory perspective, that obviously feeds in, but there's other issues that the industry needs to consider around more financing issues, and how that can play out, especially for individual utilities, and also gearing positions, and how utilities are best placed to deal with those issues. At a high level, as I said, business as usual will likely increase, result in bill increases. So these are the three scenarios that we touched on. The size of the arrow indicates, the relative materiality of the impact on bills. You can see that over time, we've tried to provide a bit of a time scale of 2030, 2040, 2050. And you can see over time that bill impact gradually increases. The exception there is then population growth in the long term, which is what I was saying in terms of that can partially offset those bill increases. And obviously, the materiality of how that change is going to depend on the different utilities themselves. The following slides we'll take through in terms of some initial results from scenarios 1 and 2 for the three different groupings, so metro, large regional, and small regional, and just to show you what the impact of that is. And as I said, so we won't be presenting numbers as such; it's more the indicative trends and directions. So this is the likely impact of just purely servicing existing customers, so no growth factored in for the metropolitan utilities, and that's likely to result in bill increases going forward, as you can see. And so obviously the dark filled in line is the high, and then the dotted line is then the low estimate based on the assumptions that have come through. You can see now with the lighter blue is scenario 2. And so that's when the population growth kicks in. And so then the growth in the customer base and the growth related capital expenditure comes into play. And you can see that that brings down that range in terms of that high and low to a lower level, still slightly increasing on the high, but much more manageable. And just also to keep in mind, these are in real terms, just to remember that. So if things are flat, it still means they're increasing in line with CPI. And so far from what we can gather, that's largely driven by the sharing of a largely fixed asset base across a larger customer base. It's also heavily dependent on the assumptions that underpin things that we'll also be refining as well. Moving on to the large regionals, you'll see that they also have an increase in terms of just purely servicing the existing customers, which has a higher relative impact in terms of the going upwards, having a steeper curve than the metros, and still having that difference between the high and low range. But it's a similar kind of trend going forward in terms of servicing those customers, the existing customer base. When we add in the population growth, this, similar to the metros, it also pulls the range down, but it doesn't do it straight away. So there's a bit of a time lag for these large regionals in terms of when the customer bills start to come down based on those increased customer numbers. So part of that, it's going to be dependent on each individual one, but one of those factors that could be impacting on that is potentially higher capital cost per new connection, which could reflect a higher proportion of greenfield developments in those larger regional ones compared to the metros, or potentially even less spare capacity in the existing network to deal with the growth that's coming on. For the small regional ones, it also has an increased one of just purely looking at the existing customer base. It's a similar kind of trend of heading upwards. And then similar to the other ones, the population growth also mitigates that bill increase. But like these large regionals, it doesn't happen straight away. It takes a little bit longer to mitigate those increases. And most likely, without going into the full details, most likely that the reasons for that probably are consistent with the reasons I was given with the large regional, the different types of growth and individual spare capacity requirements. One of the things to look at now is one of the discrete challenges which we picked out. So this is the interest rate impacts that I was discussing. I should have hidden that graph so you didn't actually start looking at it before I started talking. So given the time available, we're not going to go through all of those discrete challenges that we've flagged, but they are in the report and we're discussing with the PCG, and I'm sure you'll get a copy through Peter in due time. But we thought we'd focus on one of the ones that is quite a key one to kind of consider. And it's quite an interesting one to look at. So the ESC, as I was mentioning before, has a trailing average approach to calculating the WACC, which means they look at over the previous historical 10 years in terms of what the interest rates might look like, and that kind of rolls along as periods drop off and the new periods come on. At the moment, we're at historical low interest rates, but then if you look at the trailing average, 10 years ago, they were higher. And so what you'll find is that as the trailing average moves on, those higher interest rates will fall off and the lower interest rates will come on more. And so the actual, the process for calculating that cost of debt under the regulatory approach will result in a lower WACC going forward in the short term, even though there is a chance that interest rates are actually increasing at that same time. So what we've modelled here, and I'll flick over to now having, so now all three, metropolitan, large regional, and small regional, all the same thing. What we've got there is the starting point where they will start from is 0. So this is the incremental kind of thing. And so obviously it has a downward impact on customer bills in those first 10 years and then starts to increase and based on the assumption that in that medium to long term, interest rates will start to increase. And then it'll just take time for that to flow through into the trailing average calculation. But the main reason to highlight this is the fact that in that short term, those reductions in the WACC values based on the trailing average approach is likely to mask some of those issues that we flagged in terms of that business as usual and some of the other discrete challenges that are being considered. So it may look like, this, and it's going to depend on each individual business, but it may actually be able to offset some of those increases and look as though the bills are remaining relatively flat for some businesses, but that may be purely due to the fact that the trailing average is picking up lower interest rates that's feeding onto the cost of debt. And so it's, the cost of equity that comes through, the return on equity that comes through the building blocks model can essentially mask those cost increases that the utilities and the industry are facing. This is then a quick highlight summary of the discrete challenges that we considered. So obviously, they all have different varying impacts in terms of what they have on the bills, but we also consider the fact that there is also slightly different various likelihoods for the impacts and the challenges facing the industry. So we've tried to capture that within this matrix, and you can see there that for the most part they're all at least medium likelihood. Anything that was low, we kind of didn't really feel the need to model. So we only really considered ones that were at least medium or high challenges that the industry was likely to face. And you can see the difference in terms of the impact at that high kind of level. The ones that are the low and the moderate impacts are probably ones more that have a bit more kind of capital expenditure kind of impacts. The ones that are the high impacts are the ones probably that have a greater kind of one-for-one impact on the revenue requirement that feed through to customer bills. And that's kind of how it's played out in terms of the modelling. That significant increases in capital expenditure is kind of moderated by the fact that it's recovered, goes into the RAB and it's recovered over a long period of time, so the bill impacts aren't as great compared to a significant operating expenditure increase or increase in changes in the WACC calculation, that kind of stuff. So that's essentially a summary of where we're all at and the initial findings. So we're coming towards the end of phase 1, as Chris mentioned. So now we're essentially looking at, we need to refine these inputs and assumptions. We think the general trends are fairly robust. It's then just the magnitude of, how some of those impacts might impact on the industry. And so we're looking to kind of get your feedback through this process in the breakout sessions, and also then considering, as Jara and Chris touched on as well, the second breakout session looking at, with some of the potential ways that can be, or methods that can be used to mitigate some of these challenges for the industry going forward. So that's it from me. I think I've kept within the timeframes, Jara, and I'll hand it back to you.
Yes, so if you go on to the, I think you've got the questions on the next slide.
Yep.
So I think we're going to break out for about 8 minutes just to have a quick discussion in groups of about 4 or 5. So what is your reaction to the findings? Do they make sense for your organisation? And what more do you need to know?
There we go.
I think the outcome is that with the 40 billion, we're just going to have a bit of a whip round. Pop in your loose change, people.
Extra raffle tickets.
Must be within our collective delegations, no?
Yeah. So yeah, look, I think we're all back, Peter. Yep.
Yes, we are. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So yeah, we've got I think we've got about 10 minutes now. So just wanting to, I suppose, then touch base about where we got to. So for the 3 questions, so initial reaction to the findings, do they make sense, and what more do you need to know? I suppose any particular comments from any of the breakout rooms? What are the hot items of discussion?
I'm happy to just go first from our group to break the ice, Jara. A big topic of our time was talking about population growth, and a bit of surprise in some quarters about population growth helping to alleviate some of the cost pressures. And we had a really good discussion about a really important assumption, which is that new customer contributions are effective in offsetting new development costs. Which is a critical assumption around the way the modelling is done. We also had a bit of discussion around the nuances for regional towns, small towns, and thinking about if there's a small town that doubles in growth, the costs of doing that are going to be much greater compared to, or the per unit costs are going to be much greater than compared to doing that in a big regional centre or in Melbourne, for example. And we also had a bit of a discussion about the important implications of interest rates and that trailing average approach of the ESC. But I think people were broadly supportive of the directional nature of the findings.
Yep.
And some others.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, look, certainly in our group, debt was a figure that came up as well, and that with a lot of businesses sitting on very large levels of debt, it really doesn't take much of an interest rate change to significantly affect prices and financial sustainability as well. And that you could have it's not unforeseeable that you could have a situation with prices dropping but debt increasing with the current model. Any thoughts from any other breakout rooms?
We made the point that in terms of the second stage and what the report really says, it may be useful to flip the question on its head and say, what improvements in technology will we need, or what rate of improvement will we need in order to keep bills the same or reasonable, so that we can see the magnitude of the challenge.
Yep.
Well, one of the questions, yeah, our group wasn't surprised by the findings. However, one of the questions, Chris, that came from our group was, I think there's a general view that we're not renewing at an adequate rate for most water corps, and to what extent is that adequately considered in the work, the idea of a renewal catch-up to get on an even keel.
Yep. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. Tim, did you want to respond to that now?
So majority of the renewals CapEx primarily come from the businesses, whether it's their corporate plans or their internal financing kind of models in terms of what they're forecasting to do over the next couple of decades. So it'll be dependent on which we can obviously face it. This is the refinement of things. It's depending on what assumptions each utility has built into their, whether they are doing some of that renewals catch up, or whether, they are kind of factoring in delaying some of those renewals already in those numbers.
So it sounded like that was a question worth confirming was the sense in our group, just that, check, an honesty check or fact check or stress test, if you like, on the renewals aspect of it.
Yeah, we'll follow that up.
Yeah, and I think Well, one of the things from our one as well, I think there was a general thing that there's no surprise or nothing overly new in terms of those challenges. You know, they've been around for a while in the industry. I guess the more important thing or the bigger thing is probably going to be then phase 2 about, well, what can be done about it kind of thing going forward, and how do we address the challenges, because that kind of, most people know of the challenges and kind of are aware of them. It's then what can be done.
Yep. So yeah, Tim, do you want to go back to that? Do you want to go back to the next slide then in your presentation and talk briefly about that and introduce the next breakout?
We do have a bit of time, Jarrah, if people
You're on mute.
want feedback.
Yep.
David, did you have any summaries from your perspective to share, David Heeps?
Most of the things were covered. That one certainly about turning the issue on its head and saying what efficiencies do we have to make to keep bills the same. And also the other one, which I'd call a balanced argument, that there are some things that will work in our favour, like reduce cost of renewables. And the other one was population decline was mentioned. And I suppose this is where it becomes particularly important for the smaller towns within the regional corporations. So what happens there? And given that there's I think what it was called was a socialisation of costs within the region. So if you've got a declining township and you're going to have to meet these costs, then it's going to have an impact right across. But look, the way I would summarise, I suppose, what I've heard is that we need to think about the new customer contributions or developer contributions and making sure they're working correctly. We've got to think about the small towns, as you say, the interest rates that are declining. But the other important one is getting renewals right. And I suppose this is a problem with all CapEx forecasting. To me, it doesn't matter so much now that renewals are low, providing service standards are being maintained, but it's that bow wave that we might or might not be projecting. So getting our forecasts better would seem to be of some advantage. And certainly probably segueing into the next segment, which is that how do we use all of this information, getting our arguments balanced. So we don't want to be the Chicken Littles within Victoria, but at the same time, we need to inform good policy making about what might be happening and at what magnitude.
Yep. Thanks, David. Tim.
Before you move on, I was in the session where that issue around declining towns came up, and I didn't challenge it because it was I thought a really minor comment, but it did come up in an earlier workshop before this, a month or two ago. And I just want to reiterate, it's not an issue in our area, and I'd hate it to become perceived as a chronic issue in regional Victoria. There might be isolated areas of a few towns, but I'm really concerned it keeps coming up as if it's endemic. It's not. We actually have small growth and sometimes quite healthy growth. So.
Yep. No, thanks, Steve. Appreciate the insight there. I suppose it is the nature that, look, even within Colyburn Waters region, the majority of towns are static at best in population, but the big population centres and even some small to medium population centres are growing quite significantly, and it's how we align all of those differences and make sure that we're building infrastructure fit for all the purposes. That's a particular challenge. Thanks, Steve. Tim.
So the next breakout session, which I'm sure Pete's lining everything up again, is then essentially we've spoken about these challenges, and I think some groups probably already started thinking about what could be done. But this is essentially to feed into the phase 2 of the work, which we kind of just pasted there again, just to kind of highlight we're now kind of going, well, these were all the impacts, these are the kind of trends and materiality that we've kind of been looking at with all these challenges. Given that, what are some of the kind of, opportunities that should be considered in this phase 2? They might be particular to a particular challenge, or it might be an overarching thing across the industry that may need to be, considered, or that could be worthwhile considered. And then also the consideration of, how should the results of this study be communicated? So just to keep that in mind in the 8 minutes that we have.
Alrighty.
Ready to go.
Ready, Peter?
Thank you.
All right. So are we all back, Peter?
Yes, I think we are. Thanks, Jarrah.
Excellent. Good discussion in our room. Yeah, look, certainly part of our discussion was in relation to, I suppose, the challenge of future funding. How do we make sure that everyone's aligned for our future funding needs, which are going to be significant when you overlay capital expenditure, asset maintenance, and customer expectations. Any other thoughts?
In our group, we probably got it down to about 6 issues. The last 2 we really didn't have time to talk about much, but we talked about making sure we've got information to inform policymakers. And a cohort of that is the message we need to be sending, I suppose, is the variability that exists around the state. There's the emphasis on looking for efficiencies and better ways to do things, because keeping bills constant and facing all these challenges is only going to be met by being more efficient. We need to link any extra services we're being asked to provide with the costs of doing that and the bill impacts. The 5th one was, what would structural change do? And then the last one was, what would shared services do? Now, those last 2 we really didn't have time to discuss, but they were thrown on the table at the last moment. So they're our 6 points, I suppose.
Thanks.
Anyone else in the group want to add to that?
That's a good summary, David. Thanks.
All right.
You couldn't resolve all of those in 8 minutes, David?
No.
There was a big emphasis in our group about the communication challenge and getting really great clarity, and Joe summarised it really well around, we've got to really ensure that everyone understands the why, understands the downside risk, understands who needs to play a role, and understand from the minister to regulators to the community, the whole kit and caboodle, and that people aren't blindsided, that you get the sequencing right, and that you can provide it in a way which is a safe way to help share the understanding of the problem, and really putting a lot of thought into how you get that engagement right was a big focus of our group.
Fantastic. Thanks, Damien. Any other groups?
Look, I'll just go on our group. There were some great ideas. Running through them very quickly, we talked about technology and innovation certainly playing a role, and efficiencies playing a role, but that a lot of the low-hanging fruit have already been taken up, and a bit of a question mark about just how far we'll get with technology, and also noting that technology comes at a cost as well. Some good comments made about renewables and the potential for renewables to not only meet greenhouse gas commitments, but to reduce power costs, which is a big contributor to bills in many areas. Great discussion, great idea around construction costs and significant escalation in construction costs across the industry. And why is that the case? Does the industry need to have a look at how it commissions construction works and capital works, and why is it so expensive? Is it just because there's an infrastructure boom in Victoria, or are there other things about the way that the water corps go about their business that are driving higher costs of construction, and other regulations that drive some of those costs? We talked about costs associated with reporting things in similar ways. There was ideas around sharing that cost burden fairly across the whole state. Ideas around shared services and some of the other things have already been covered off. So, yep, some good points there. Then,
thanks, Chris.
Anyone else from our group want to raise anything that I haven't done justice?
Oh, we did have that brief discussion about recycled water and whether that could provide mitigations to expansion to the water network.
Yeah, correct. And I mentioned there, we've got some fairly coarse assumptions around the way climate change might impact capital and operational costs going forward. It's clearly came through in our previous round of workshops as a big issue. It's very hard to model, what might be the impacts of climate change, when a severe drought might drive major augmentations. But if those augmentations are constrained and you can't choose the least cost option, and if something like a recycled water scheme might be part of that least cost option, then that's going to just add to the challenge of meeting climate change and adapting. So yeah, that was a great point. Sorry, I missed that one, Joanne.
That's all right.
One of the things from our one that I was going to raise, and it kind of stemmed from the early discussion, the fact that a lot of the initial finding stuff isn't necessarily new. It's fairly commonly accepted or known throughout the industry and has been experiencing for a little bit. And so we didn't necessarily get into specifics of particular things, but more of a theme around being bold. These challenges have been around for a while. They still haven't gone away from doing the same kind of stuff that the industry's done over a period of time. The industry's tended to kind of, roll along in the same kind of processes and the same kind of, thinking within the industry. And so the theme of essentially being bold and rethinking the industry to kind of really address some of these things going forward. So I thought I'd just kind of put that out there to see whether there was similar thoughts in other areas or whether that was more just our group.
Yep, thanks, Tim. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, I think it's the nature of our assets is that we've got some that were built over 100 years ago, and the ones we're building today will still be there in over 100 years' time. And but ultimately, our customer base is very different to what it was 100 years ago, and I think we definitely need to be ready to change and to adapt to what our customers are expecting. And I think the services that we'll provide in the future that may not only be water and sewer, but it will really be getting into that livability space and helping our communities, live better lives. So any other final comments? We're almost at the end. We've probably got time for one or two more comments.
Yes, in our group, we discussed the opportunity of having one consolidated view of the sector. At least we have some opportunities to have a strong narrative. The first opportunity that is coming up is DELWP's sustainable water strategy for the central region in Gippsland. And that's an opportunity to have a discussion, perhaps also with our communities and our customers. Frank, open engagement around what are these curly challenges and how can we collectively have a good approach at looking at the longevity, the transgenerational issues. So those are the opportunities in phase 2.
Yep. Thanks, Livia. Any other final comments?
Jarrah, I was just going to, I mentioned in my group that what form will the reporting be and how much individual benefit could there be to water authorities in seeing how they compare to others in the impacts?
Yeah, well, good question, Nigel. I think the purpose of this work, as per the terms of reference agreed with the managing directors, is that this will really serve as a whole of sector piece. I can't wait to get into modelling what it looks like for Colaban Water, and I'm sure that each individual business will be able to really look ahead at its own work as well. And I'm sure that Aither would be happy to assist others too in doing that. I think there's an opportunity now in the next couple of years to just make sure that we've got all the settings right before we move into the next pricing submission period, just to make sure that that the whole approach is fit for purpose and that the outcomes that we want to achieve as custodians of very long life assets, the outcomes we want to achieve for our customers are actually achievable with the current model and the current settings that we've got.
Yeah, thanks, Jara. And I'll just add to that. It's a really good point, Nigel. And yeah, look, obviously we would be happy to have further discussions around individual water corps, but I would also note that I think this is probably an iterative process as well. Our analysis and the assumptions are going to be highly uncertain in some areas, and there will be value in, say, revisiting some of this stuff at an industry level in 6-12 months' time, and finding issues that are, really important, and going to that next level of detail around, how can we get greater confidence in the assumptions that have been made. So I think there's, a couple of areas where it could be refined and improved over time, because this is a relatively small study, and we're trying to get orders of magnitude and directional changes, not nail it down to, individual towns, individual water corps, and specific issues nailed down to a decimal place. It's just not going to meet that need, but it will meet the high level need, and that's what and I think it's a good starting point for that.
I think you're right, Chris, because one of the things that we discussed in our group was the sharing of the information broader than just the industry. And Joe mentioned, which I thought was quite appropriate, it's about providing the minister with enough information, like a gift, to be prepared for the future and know what's coming. And if we need to change or alter policy settings at this point to assist us to be in a better position now, rather than waiting 4, 5, 10, 15 years in that space, then making the information available so that you can be adequately armed to address those challenges.
Yeah, nicely said, Neville. Nicely said.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in for a sec? I'm wondering, a question to Peter Morrison without notice. It might be useful just to share with people what are the next steps in your mind's eye, and the timing around those, because I know there was a couple of queries about that.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So the next steps are, well, Chris has outlined to some extent, it's a phase 2 moving into now, where the organisations, the MDs will be able to get back together and discuss some of these options with the Aither team. It's expected that pulling this together, we've got a draft report. What you've seen today is the early findings. That's being packaged up and going to be disseminated to the MDs shortly. Moving into phase 2, we'll be seeing the options that you've discussed and others, and bringing that together and having a final report at the end of October. That's the process. There's been a few independent experts, I should also mention, involved in this that Chris and the team have consulted with, that have been very helpful as well. Greg Wilson being one of them, and another few as well. So it's been really good to get their input.
Yep. All right. Well, look, I think in the interest of time, we're a few minutes over, but I think the discussion's been fantastic. So look, thanks everyone for the discussion today. I'm glad we could have a really good participative session on this topic. And yeah, look, we're if any answers to those questions that we had before, please send them. Send them through to Peter, and yeah, let's keep this discussion up. Let's make sure we've got the right settings that are fit for purpose for the industry as we go forwards, to make sure that we can tackle the challenges. So thanks for attending today. 3:15 is the next session.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jarrett. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That was excellent contribution to our thinking. Much appreciated. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Jara. Thanks all.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.